I'm going to step back as the moderator from this one. And I believe Eva is going to be coming back in. In fact, here she is. So all I'll say is I hand off to her for the start of this next panel. Is I think we started to touch on a lot of these themes in the panel we were just talking about. I think for every discussion led by folks who might be, gosh, what I'd call, tech weenies, like me, there's also an individual on the other end of that who is often impacted by the systems that we're building and creating. And so I think this next session is going to really try to focus on some of those perspectives around how the identity systems we have in place today impact individuals and look at perspectives of equity and inclusion. With that, let me hand it off to Eva to kick off the panel. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yes, we are going to look at a little bit different aspect of this. We've talked about the fraud issues and some of those other systemic issues, but we need to look at some of these foundational issues like access to and lack of control over identity documents and identity credentials. So we have a wonderful panel today. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and let each of the panelists introduce themselves, their organization, and if they are so inclined, their why. So let's kick it off and start with Ben.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Reverend Ben Roberts. I'm at Foundry United Methodist Church here in Washington, D.C. Part of my work as an associate pastor and director of social justice ministries was a ministry that we call the ID ministry, and we're helping individuals with who are unhoused or low income not only navigate the ID process so they can secure their documents, but also pay for the documents, as that can be a barrier to things like housing, education, employment, or receiving public benefits, that kind of stuff.
Great, thanks, Ben. Let's go on to you, Anne, and then Theresa.
Thank you. I need to give first the standard disclaimer that the views I express here are my personal views only and do not represent the position of the Department of the Treasury or any other part of the U.S. government. I work in Treasury's Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, which is part of a larger office, the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, where I focus on innovation, particularly digital identity from a national security, combating illicit financing, and financial inclusion perspective. We are interested in supporting responsible innovation and technology, including trustworthy digital identity solutions, as a power center for good, enabling people to access safe, fit-for-purpose financial services, as well as a tool for combating illicit financing activities, both keeping bad actors out of the financial system and being able to trace and identify, trace, and recover illicit proceeds when they are generated by illegal activities. I think I will leave it to Theresa to explain the broader operations of our office, but as the policy and development and outreach shop for TFI, we do work closely with the other components, including FinCEN, and we lead the U.S. government delegation to the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global standard-setting body for legal, regulatory, and operational measures for combating terrorist financing, money laundering, proliferation financing, and other illicit financial activities. And we have spearheaded the FATF's work on digital identity for the global standard-setting body. TFFC was the project co-chair and lead author of the FATF's Digital Identity Guidance, which was issued in March of last year and promoted a flexible, risk-based approach to the use of digital identity solutions to comply with specific global AML CFT standards, focusing on requirements for customer identification and verification at onboarding. And as all of the preceding panels have emphasized, the COVID-19 crisis and the importance of social distancing has highlighted the need for all of us, individuals, businesses, governments, and NGOs, to be able to conduct safe, secure financial transactions remotely. That means digitally, online, or in-app, and trustworthy digital solutions are an essential driver of those financial services. That is one reason why the FATF standards are so important. They help us implement trustworthy digital identity solutions for customer onboarding and conducting transactions, not only in this country, but worldwide. And the work that Mike Mosier highlighted that FinCEN is doing domestically in his excellent keynote is something that we need to see, and that the FATF helps drive in jurisdictions around the world. So that's our why.
Thank you, Anne. Theresa.
Hi, everyone. And I'm Theresa Forbes in that same office working with Anne, but I cover our human rights and corruption policy lead for Treasury. So I work very closely with Anne. As you hear, she is the expert on innovation, digital ID. We work hand in hand on how we can incorporate issues like how digital ID can be used for financial inclusion and helping survivors and those impacted by human rights abuse and corruption. So I look forward to our conversation today. Thank you for having me here.
Thanks, Theresa. And last, but certainly not least, Shawn.
Hey, Eva, thank you. Look, thanks so much for having us. Shawn Holtzclaw, I'm executive director of the Knoble. A long time ago, before this gray hair, I was an accountant and an attorney and had the chance to run global businesses at Equifax and Fiserv in data and analytics and risk and payments and supply chain. Let me tell you what the Knoble is in a sentence, which is also our why. The Knoble is a nonprofit. We're a global network of subject matter experts, like many of those on this panel and in the audience, who focus on helping prevent financial crime that harms vulnerable people around the world. So vulnerable people, think of those subject to trafficking and slavery and child exploitation and elder abuse and the like. All of our work is focused on enabling financial institutions and those organizations and fintechs that support them, law enforcement and government to detect and report and prevent human crime. And so look forward to being able to share here. Feel free to follow us for free at the Knoble with a K.com. And Eva, we really appreciate all that you do. Eva's on our board of advisors and is a tremendous asset to our work to help prevent human crime.
Well, thanks for that, Shawn. I guess I got to buy you coffee later. This is a wonderful panel. Everyone, thank you for being here. I think to set the tone, I'd love to hear from Ben telling us, what you're seeing on the ground. You are really in the trenches, and please share some of those experiences with the audience and the folks that are listening about what you're seeing at ID Ministry and the help you're providing and some of those barriers. When you mentioned that you help provide, pay the fees for the costs of these identity documents, it's so easy for us to forget that $10, $15, $20 to replace an identity document can be the difference between someone obtaining it and obtaining it.
Yeah, absolutely. And where I am, it's all kind of user experience, I suppose, with the systems and the policies that are getting created and built. And what we had typically seen prior to pandemic, you're looking at an average cost for somebody around $68 if we're talking about a birth certificate and an ID in DC. That doesn't include things like transportation to go from place to place. If you have to find childcare, if you have to take off time from work, it's just kind of $68 for the documents that you have to pay for. And that's in ideal circumstances, presuming that you only need to get a social security card, which is free, get your birth certificate, and then get your ID credential. That would usually take around a month at best if somebody came to see me and had no documents on hand to start with. That would be fast. I've had it take upwards of 3 years for an individual to complete the process from zero to a valid ID. Now that we're kind of into our pandemic mode, time and cost have both increased. We are still not with in-person service at the Vital Records office in DC. Everything is online now through VitalCheck. And because of that, we saw a 65% increase per birth certificate, going from 23 with an added on $15.99 to each piece. And when you're talking about folks who are earning $17,000 a year or less, that's a huge cost and quickly becomes a barrier. And that's while they're trying to do things like get a job or get into housing to get stable. We work typically with people who have lost documents from anything from like a house fire, which is very easily to be sympathetic toward, to evictions, which we're kind of on the precipice if we don't continue to delay with policy, all the way to kind of the more heartbreaking things that I see in terms of someone who sleeps on the street and then the city comes by and clears all of their belongings and they lose their document in that way. So these are the types of situations that we tend to see each week. And they're not really typical for what I imagine like the regular user experience that is in mind when we're kind of developing the software systems to help with like the knowledge-based assessments or to help in terms of like just the amount of processing that has to happen. I don't think that these stories are really upfront as we're building those systems and these policies. Just in the last 10 days, and one that I think fits really well today, as we've talked about the unbanked and folks who are just kind of at risk from being on their own. We're working currently with a young lady, did not know her parents growing up, lived with her aunt until her senior year of high school when her aunt died. And because of that death, she became homeless. Luckily, she got into college, so she's currently housed through the college. However, she is not banked. She does not have her ID. She can't open a banking account. And that's what kind of spurred her to come and see us. But in this process, we learned that what we're calling a typo is on the birth certificate, where her first name is spelled ending with an N instead of how she has spelled it her entire life, ending with an A. And that one letter has prevented her from being able to get the breeder document, which is the birth certificate. And that then prevents her from successfully completing the process for the Social Security card because, of course, the documents aren't matching in that instance. She can't produce proof of Social Security through her W-2 because the full number is not on there, even though she is employed and getting paid. And with all of this, getting back to that unbanked portion, she can't cash the full value of her check. She has to go to a check cashing operation that takes a percentage, and that includes not only her regular work checks, but also the stimulus checks that she received, which would have been a huge boon for her as she's on her own. But that puts her not only in a situation where she loses a portion of her income, but it also puts her in an unsafe situation, she feels, where she has to carry large amounts of cash around, and that doesn't feel safe at all for her. And so as we're going through this process, the standard procedure just isn't available for her. And we have to go through the extra hoops of having a caseworker apply on her behalf, which takes extra time, submit by mail. And even with you may have heard of some like delays in the mail systems right now. Those are real, and it impacts the way that people can kind of move on with their life. With her, it's just opening a bank account. With so many of my folks, it's delays for getting a job or getting into housing, where you are perhaps getting sober for the first time, but the delay for housing took so long, you had a relapse. And I'm dealing with that right now with some of my neighbors. All of this comes down to cost and money. We can handle the cost. We can't really do anything about how long it takes for individuals to get some of these things done. And so we're always interested in these spaces to know that people are thinking beyond the typical user experience to things that may seem like kind of one-off or an oddity or an abnormality in what people experience. But for me, we experience these things every single week, and we're helping close to 2,000 people a year. They're not an oddity for us. They're real and they're frequent. And so we're always interested in knowing that the policymakers and system builders are paying attention to those experiences as well.
So 2,000 one-offs in 1 year in one small region.
Yes.
Such a good reminder that we have to have our systems take these things into consideration. And that's really that lack of access conversation, but there's another piece to this, and that's the lack of control. There are folks, particularly in the human trafficking space, where they may know and they may have some level of access to their foundational identity documents and their identity credentials, but they don't have control over them. Someone is using them, and maybe they're doing it through coercion, maybe it's through threat of violence, but this is another group and another population that we have to really keep our eyes focused on and realize that we have to implement systems and processes that help address that. And I'd like to turn it now to Theresa. If you could share some of the insights and key findings from the report to Congress, that analysis of anti-money laundering efforts related to human trafficking, I think that we can get some good insight from some of that other aspect.
Sure, thank you. And just to kind of reiterate what was said earlier, we're looking at these illicit finance threats and systemic initiatives to enhance integrity and transparency of our international financial system. And that includes human rights and corruption. And so the way we look at human trafficking, for example, is through that lens of how it intersects with corruption and how it is a human rights abuse when someone is being trafficked or subject to slavery and forced labor. So we really take a kind of whole approach, and how can we use all of our tools and authorities to combat human trafficking, not only about going after the bad guys and those that are perpetrating and profiting from human trafficking, but how can we use our financial tools to really help those that are impacted by human rights abuse, survivors of human trafficking. And that's the work that I do with Anne is critically important. And I really rely on her as the subject matter expert on digital ID. When I first started on this, I was like, I know digital ID is a great tool, but how can we really use it and really just going with her and her expertise? Okay, how can we mesh what you're doing in the broader context of bringing digital ID, and how can we integrate that in what we're trying to do in a human rights context in combating human trafficking? So it's so critically important. It's so critically important that we break down these kind of silos and barriers, not only within our own institutions, but having those partnerships. And so that was one of the key findings within our report, which I'll get to in a second. And I believe others before me have also spoken about how important partnerships are. Partnerships between civil society and the private sector, fintech, partnerships with financial institutions, and partnerships with government, and our partnerships with other governments to be able to make this a reality for all those across the world. It's so critically important. And as you mentioned, particularly survivors of human trafficking or those that are affected through migration or refugee and asylum issues, they can lack those foundational documents. And so it's critically important not only for them to be able to access the banking system, but also to be able to access all of these other types of potential benefits that they may be able to receive. So Treasury has been really leading these efforts, and specifically Anne, to support this risk-based approach to adopt responsible digital solutions for survivors of human trafficking and others to help obtain access to the financial system. So when we were tasked by Congress to produce a report in consultation with the financial institutions, NGOs, and survivors on human trafficking on what are our money laundering efforts as a government as well as private sector efforts on combating money laundering associated with human trafficking, that was something we really wanted to ensure that was in there and in this report, because we see it's so critically important. It's great to have strong AML controls. We need to have that, but then we also need to be able to use our tools to help support victims. So I'll highlight kind of what we put together with working with private sector, NGOs, and survivors to really help improve our efforts in this area. So we have stated, that Congress should consider passing legislation to allocate grant dollars to be able to assist victims, help them obtain credentials or identity verification services to help them get either a driver's license or a state ID card. Because this would really help survivors of human trafficking be able to obtain those ID documents. I mean, in many cases, their bank accounts can be taken over by their trafficker. And so not only do they lack foundational documents in some cases. They also lack access to be able to get their own bank account. So it's so critically important. So what we're doing is really looking at remedies for human trafficking survivors and barriers for them in obtaining legitimate banking services, and other barriers as well when it comes to fraudulent activity and purchases in their name when it's misused by traffickers. And one thing, I was recently a part of a panel right before this one, and we were speaking of some international solutions, and one of the countries was talking about how they are implementing a digital ID program to help those that are getting relief from the pandemic, those from low-income areas in particular that have been marginalized, and using digital ID to help them access to be able to get and use that money that they're getting from the government to be able to buy groceries and essential items like that. So there's so much work on this, and I'm going to just particularly focus kind of on the human trafficking aspect of it. But it really does apply so much more broadly to so many different individuals that need it. And so back on partnerships, one thing that we did 2 years ago was hosting at Treasury our Partnership to Combat Human Rights Abuse and Corruption event, where we're bringing together the NGOs, industry, and other government partners on information sharing and coordination on the illicit finance and corruption networks that are associated. This past year, however, we kind of took a different approach to really talk about, using financial tools to help survivors. So Anne actually led a panel with myself and others on information sharing models and ways that different partners across the globe are using digital identity to help survivors of human trafficking. And so our panel really focused on these different types of solutions. And a lot of the details I'm going to leave to Anne because she is the expert on this, and I really rely on her to help with that. But really to help support financial inclusion and victim services for those persons or refugees and human trafficking, those survivors of natural disasters and other individuals that are facing major disruptions. So we really wanted to help prevent the exploitation and displacement in the first place. And so we looked at how innovation and technology can be a power center for good. And so we had the UN High Commissioner for Refugees speaking, as well as Microsoft's Digital Identity Group and the head of the Secretariat for what's called the FAST Initiative, the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking. And so they really talked about, and I just want to highlight some of these kind of public-private partnerships that are out there to be able to get digital ID services to help these individuals. So the UNHCR was really looking at displaced persons and other people in humanitarian crisis to help them get immediate assistance and then access to some long-term financial inclusion issues such as access to housing, healthcare, employment, and education. So they were providing and teaming up with the private sector on deploying digital identities for displaced persons and refugees. One of those partners was Microsoft, and they spoke about their digital identity innovation space and how they're partnering on identity proofing and authentication in this area. And their solution obviously applies pretty broadly to all kinds of different services, but it was really interesting to hear how it's being particularly used in this case to help get access and to help those who are impacted. Really brought it down to a practical application of these different types of innovation and technology tools. So they were looking at in-person customer identification, verifying onboarding, and other pilots that they're doing across the world. And then lastly, the FAST initiative was looking at digital identity solutions and services to reduce vulnerabilities for forced labor and forced migration in both developing and developed countries. So they've been really encouraging the use of alternative underwriting for microfinance loans and microinsurance, digital financial planning tools, and digital identity solutions that can get access to facilitate access to financial services. So this is on reducing vulnerabilities, but also on the response side, they identified how personal identity information and identity evidence can be used to conduct illicit financial activities as a common occurrence for types of different abuse and exploitation. And so they're really kind of looking at this and working with financial institutions and governments across the world, not only on digital ID, but so many other things. So I have those resources and I can add them to the chat. And thanks, Jeremy, for adding the report into the chat, where we really tried to make that note to Congress, where this was something that we heard from the private sector, from survivors of human trafficking and NGOs that are serving victims of human trafficking, that they really needed to see these digital identity solutions deployed within state governments as well. So I'll turn it over back to you, and I'm happy to answer questions later. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Theresa. And Anne, if you just want to follow up maybe some of your insights just to support what Theresa was saying, maybe just a couple of minutes so we can make sure we get to all of the questions, that would be wonderful.
Well, thank you. But I think she covered it so well at both the high level, but also the example in the human trafficking space of how digital identity really is critical for enabling digital financial services, whether they're in response to victimization or in a preventive way. So I think we should just let the other panelists have a little more time.
Well, with that, all of that, Shawn, this is a question directed at you. How do you think that using this information from what Ben has said and the report from Treasury, these events on the ground and these other insights, how can we better inform our financial systems approach regarding the topic of exploitation and vulnerable people, in particular human trafficking, but just vulnerable people?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so much there, but if you think about the importance of access to financial systems or other systems, right? It's foundational. If it doesn't exist, how can you detect and prevent human trafficking, for example? So let's use an example, right? So all of us who are in the systems, we're out at dinner, we get a text, we look down at the text and it goes, hey, did you do this? Did you charge $50 to so-and-so in a card not present transaction? And I go, no, I didn't. What happens? Instantaneously, that fraud is stopped. No more losses occur. And then they send me a card and say, please, happy consumer, go on tomorrow in 24 hours and spend some more. Right? What is that? It's an ecosystem that exists. It's an ecosystem that detects real-time bad things happening in the financial system. Right? All of us in the financial system, government, laws, the banks themselves, the governing bodies of the banks, the regulators, all of those who support financial institutions, whether we're technologists or data providers or software providers, financial crime leaders, it goes on and on and on, right? All of our jobs primarily are focused around allowing good things to happen in those systems and not having bad things to happen in those systems. So if you have access to people who are vulnerable, if human trafficking victims or survivors or those that are subject to being abused and manipulated have access to financial systems, that significantly reduces the risk of them being subject to something bad happening. Once they're in that system, once they're there, then we have all of these things, card not present, AML, all the things that we're working on together. They're not there, they need to be improved, but they exist, right? They're there. They can then allow for the detection of human trafficking, for example, happening in a system, and that can lead to prevent it. And that then leads to, what do we need to do to make it better? So again, leaving the criticality of some form of identity has to happen for individuals to be able to be pulled into these systems, right? For their benefit, and then for the benefit of us being able to detect and prevent bad things that are happening. We have to start looking at it differently. In a couple of the ways, we humbly submit, as Theresa said, everyone's acknowledging right now that we have to do this with public, private, and charitable partnerships. That's the only way that it's going to ultimately happen. We can learn from business models, network models that are out there as well, which is really the underlying premise behind the Knoble. What did Uber tell us? What did Apple's App Store tell us? Pick something else, right, that deals with network and shared value creation. It's not that the things don't exist, right? Uber said you don't have to build 10 million taxis. You don't have to train 10 million drivers. You just have to leverage and enable what's there in a different way. Well, all of us are out there in a different way. Everybody that's here are doing something in some way to help the vulnerable, right? And if we can just combine and leverage those efforts and see what needs to be improved, then we can make a big difference. It doesn't have to be built. It just has to be leveraged. And so those are some of the ideas I think that could then fit in, right? When a digital identity, for example, can exist and we can bypass the horrific situations that Reverend Ben mentioned. You have somebody who can then be empowered and can be included and then can be part of a system where all of us are able to focus on enabling the good and stopping the bad.
You know, that's great. I love that concept. Let's leverage the tools that we already have in our toolbox. In the last panel, when they were talking about the systems and the different systems that we need, let's not build a brand new system for this one thing. Let's look at what exists and leverage that. So I do think that's a really important message for everyone to, you know, we need to let that sink in. So we've got about 10 more minutes. And I would love to, let's take all of these insights and all of this information and go around and talk about, you know, where do we go from here? How do we move forward? How do we take this, and what are some practical thoughts you have for either a next step or, you know, I love to say if you had a magic wand and you could wave it, what would be the one thing that you would do and make happen? So we can spend a couple of minutes talking about what that would be. Ben, let's go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, thanks. Certainly, I think it kind of boils down for us, and what we experience is some of this this cost and it's time. And it's got to cost less for folks who are really vulnerable. It's got to take less time for people who are in need of the credential in order to proceed with their normal life. Those things are both real. And then just continually recognizing, I don't think anybody's delusional about this, but like the systems that we have in place are imperfect. A lot of times, some of the knowledge-based assessments that we encounter, they are drawing on information that, for like a younger guest of mine, they're drawing on information of their parents. And if there's a severed relationship there, which we've had come up a number of times, they're asking the kid questions about a parent they never knew who owned property in Florida. And the child is sitting there trying to verify their identity. They're like, I've never lived in Florida in my life. And so they fail the KBA and they're further delayed in that. And so just continually having the policymakers and the system builders consider these kind of extraordinary events as it compares to the average user. And just remember that they're not really that extraordinary. They are happening time and again from where I'm sitting. And I'm seeing more organizations kind of popping up around the country right now, kind of focused on it from the voter ID perspective, but they're running into the same problems that we've been running into for close to 2 decades now. They're motivated because they want people to vote. I'm still motivated because I want people housed and employed and serviced in the proper way. And I would love for people to also be able to vote. It comes down to what state are you in. So I'm like, let's really be mindful going forward as this thing has kind of hit light speed because of the pandemic and us needing to be more online. Let's really be mindful as we continue these developments that there are user experiences out there that are not necessarily included currently in the development.
Thanks, Ben. And Anne, let's go to you. What would you do with that magic wand?
Well, having listened to Ben, I'd like to kind of revise what I had in mind, which is one thing I think one really needs to be responsive to the needs that he was talking about. And so one of my magic wands would be that people take advantage of the risk-based approach when you're dealing with regulatory requirements for digital identity, which does allow various different kinds of identity attributes and different levels of assurance depending upon the risk. And the FATF guidance goes into considerable detail about how a risk-based approach to digital identity can support financial inclusion and kind of opening accounts and access where risk can be mitigated in other ways, for example, with low value beginner accounts, that sort of thing. And so I think that both leveraging the technical standards and trust framework of NIST and an understanding that there is flexibility because our BSA and AML framework here in this country, as well as the global standards established by FATF, do emphasize a risk-based approach for customer due diligence, including customer identification and verification. So I just was very moved by Ben's kinds of experience. But the other thing is that my bigger wish, or separate wish, because of course I'm greedy, so I want the genie in the lamp to give me two and not just one, but it would be that all relevant stakeholders, including Congress and the American public, would really understand that trustworthy digital identity is a critical element of this country's financial sector infrastructure, and that it's essential for our recovery from the COVID crisis, as well as equitable access and opportunities in all different sectors, whether it's financial, educational, healthcare, and with that understanding, treat the development and implementation of responsible, privacy-preserving digital identity ecosystem, with both the private sector and government playing our appropriate roles, as a matter of national security and economic recovery and competitiveness priority. And that would include adequate funding. That's my big wish.
I love those. I say hear, hear. And to Ben, I understand completely what you're saying. We can't build systems and build things based on the exception, but we can have universal processes that people can use when they find themselves being the exception. And I'd like to, that would be my magic wand. I'd like to see more attention paid to building those remediation and recovery processes in a very universal manner, so that, you know, everyone has access to them and anyone can use them for themselves. So with that, let's go to Theresa, and then, you know, Shawn, we'll let you wrap up.
Wow. Well, after Anne, I mean, as I said, and you hear, she's really the expert on this, and I yield my wish to Anne since she had two, because that's just incredible. And that's exactly why, like, she was selected by the Financial Action Task Force to help pass the guidance on digital ID. Like, she knows this stuff and she knows how it applies in this area. So I yield my wish to Anne, and I don't know if Anne wants
I get another one.
but I mean, she just said it so well, and that would absolutely be my wish. Particularly this one, I think it's just so important to be able to use these types of services and to be able to encourage not only Congress but American people how this is.
That's awesome. I tell you what, Anne, let's go to Shawn, and if we have time, then you can have a third. We'll let you.
That one might get me in trouble. Maybe we should forget that one.
All right, so Anne, my wish requires your two wishes to come true. So in a sentence, proactive, real-time detection, prevention, and prosecution of human crime, which is underpinned by a true cross-industry data sharing. That would be my wish. The bad guys in the world operate in real time and in an agile and nimble way, and we have to do the same if we're going to ultimately win.
Well, and that requires involvement. It requires all of us to step out of our, our sort of defined roles and get involved. And I know I saw Jeremy sharing in the QA that folks can get involved with Ben's organization, with the ID ministry. Folks can get involved with the Knoble. Their mission is amazing, and they're highly collaborative. And of course, at the risk of sounding very self-serving, you can get involved with the Identity Theft Resource Center. Anne and Theresa, I don't know how folks can help the Treasury Department and how they can get involved, but I suspect you could probably find a way. We do have 2 more minutes. We can open it up to just sort of closing thoughts from everyone, unless you guys want to yield and let Anne have her third wish.
Oh, no.
So closing thoughts, any final remarks as we wrap it up?
I mean, I'll just jump back and say, you know, as these things continue to come online, I'm re-experiencing like 2013, 2014, when the standards for Real ID came into place, and we went from a space of seeing clients succeed at around 79% of the time overnight to only succeeding at a rate of around 39% of the time. That's huge for people. So as we're rolling things out, as we're bringing things online, as new policy is put in, as new systems come into play, really do your level best to ensure that people are not getting left behind, or to build in, Eva, as you said, kind of those kind of remedial steps, as it were, for recovery and things like that. Go ahead and put them in place now so that I'm not having to come fight you later. That would be really great.
Well, I think we're at time. Jeremy, I think you're going to pop back on. This was a wonderful panel. Thank you, everyone. I personally, it was a good reminder and I learned a lot. I hope the audience did as well.
Thank you, Eva, and thanks to everybody on the panel, Theresa, Anne, Shawn, Ben. Great discussion. There was somebody in the comments who, I'll paraphrase what they said, but it was basically along the lines of, holy smokes, I can't believe all of these issues are so out there and urgent. Why aren't we doing more? And I don't want this to, take the pitch of a telethon or something like that. But that is, one reason that FIDO and ID Theft Resource Center and Better Identity Coalition are doing this event and, collaborating on advocacy in this space is there's a lot of stuff that's kind of broken right now when it comes to identity infrastructure. And, all those issues are being exacerbated, quite a bit over the last year, now that you literally can't do almost anything in person these days. And everything's been forced online. So, you heard, Congressman Foster before saying he's optimistic with the new administration. Maybe we can make this a little bit more of a priority. And, that's what we're hoping to do.